we have Taylor Haas. Taylor is in Michael Wagner's lab, and he's a second-year master's student. He got his bachelor's in zoology from the University of Oklahoma, and he's going to be talking about an assessment of the physiological effects from the surgical implantation of a dummy JSATS microacoustic transmitter in juvenile sea lamprey. So with that, take it away, Taylor.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. That's a mouthful. Appreciate that. Yeah, so with that, I will get started. And really what the gist of this study is, there was a new technology. It started in 2008 with this microacoustic transmitter built originally for salmon smolts. And this, you can see the C right here is your typical pit tag. Which it's a remote sensing technology. You implant it in fish. It's similar to like a microchip you put in a pet. The fish swim downstream or in the lake or whatever, you put receivers out, you detect them, you can trace their movement a little bit. The problem with the pit tags, the range is pretty restrictive. About a meter and a half is all you're going to get. So these battery powered transmitters that you see A and B here was the first really small tag that you could put in fish. And with that amplified read range, you can get somewhere between 50 to 100 meters of detection range. 2017, that salmon tag got modified to a smaller, less, like a thinner tag that could fit into small eel-like fishes, which is where my project comes into play. And just some specifics of the tag. It's about the same size as a 12 millimeter pit tag. That's what this A is right here. This B is my tag. It lasts about 35 days. Your detection range on a good day is somewhere between 80, 90 meters. And so it's been in other fish similar to a sea lamprey, the Pacific lamprey and American eel, it's worked with resounding results. So my project was focused on testing how this thing worked and looked in sea lamprey. So the question of why are we doing this? Some of you guys, I'm sure, are innately familiar with this graphic. This is the sea lamprey life cycle graphic. And the reason why we're doing this is to, it has the ability to inform a lot of mysteries on the lamprey life cycle. So lamprey are like salmon. They swim upstream, they die, they spawn, the larvae grow up, they outmigrate, and then they recycle or they restart the cycle again. So as mentioned, this has the capability to inform a lot that we don't know about the sea lamprey life cycle. Specifically this part, the downstream migration, and that's the focus of this experiment on what we call transformers. And a little bit of reasoning, other than just it's fun to know the unknown. From an economic perspective, knowing this behavior can save money. We don't know anything really about the speed of migration. We don't know, do these animals, are they more likely to die the longer they're in the river? We don't know anything about that for the most part because of these detection deficiencies that we've had in the past with pit tags. So this tag has a lot of potential to inform us on things, and specifically from an economic perspective, habitat-induced mortality. So this is the field study system, which I just finished this project. This presentation's over the lab proof of concept, but you can see this is the White River, White Lake complex in kind of central western Michigan. It's a tributary to Lake Michigan. You've got a river right here that flows into what we call a drowned river mouth. And theoretically, we know, biologically speaking, there's more predators in these interfaces down here than there are in the river. So it would make sense if there's predation happening on lamprey that they would be more likely to die in this lake than they would the river. Biologically, like I said, that makes sense, but we have no idea if that's true. But it's something that we might want to know, because if that is in fact the case, then managers, people treating these streams for sea lamprey larvae could say, well, if there's a drowned river mouth that they're more likely to die in, then maybe we don't need to spend as much money treating with chemicals on that complex, because there's going to be some natural mortality. So before we could do any of that, we had to do a proof of concept laboratory study. And why do we have to do that? Well, one of the basic assumptions you're looking at when you perform these telemetry studies is that the tag does not affect or alter the behavior of tagged individuals. Any information, any extrapolation modeling, whatever you do from these studies, you're under the understanding and the assumption that these are naturally acting organisms. So that's what this lab study I set out to do. And to do that, there were 3 goals. One, we wanted to determine if the implantation of this transmitter affected the survival and the swimming of sea lamprey. If this technology, if the sea lamprey die, if they can't swim as well with the tag in it, then you need to take that into consideration. We wanted to determine the likelihood a tag will be shed in 60 days. If you're doing a field study and your tag falls out and you get ping, 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 ping in the same spot, does that mean that the fish is dead, or does that mean it's just chilling on a rock somewhere? Something else we needed to find out. And then third, we wanted a tangible covariate to be able to look at after the surgery and determine goals 1 and 2, the predictability of those based on that. So I picked wound health for that. Is it possible to look at a wound and extrapolate the likelihood that this animal's going to swim naturally or going to survive? So to do that, experimental design, we got 2 different sources of animals. Got some from the Great Lakes, some anadromous animals from the Atlantic Ocean. Had 59 of them. We put microtransmitters in. Had 54 that entered as controls. Put them in 4 tanks for the control, 4 tanks for the tag. Put in dirt from a nearby river, and then natural unfiltered lake water from Lake Huron, straight from the source. It was heated a little bit to, this was done in the wintertime. So it was heated to about 4.5 to 5 degrees Celsius, which is the temperature at which they would normally outmigrate in the late fall. So a little bit about our sample demographics, and this is where things get a little interesting from an information perspective, is we chose animals between 140 and 160 millimeters to control for size. But what that did for the anadromous animals, in the red, this is the historical catch, in the blue, this is our length density from the experimental population. And you can see these are right on the mean. That's about what you'd expect from a natural population. However, the Great Lakes animals, they were smaller than historical catch. So what that means is anything that happens in this experiment, we could kind of look at it as almost a worst case scenario, in the sense that, well, these are the smaller animals that are more likely to have any effects from the tag, because it's proportionally a bigger implantation in their body than what you might expect in a natural occurring outmigratory animal. So what did we do? We measured them. We measured mortality and sheds every day. Tyler Bruning at Hammond Bay checked the tanks for me, let me know if any animals died. We scored the wound health every day, or excuse me, 5 times throughout the period. And then we did 2 swim tests. We did a burst swim test and then a swim to exhaustion test. And how did we take these measurements to find out the information that we wanted to find out? Well, for the wounds, we came up with a scale. We scored two different ways. We scored the wound closure and also the infection criteria. So this animal, distended intestines, very open. That's a really bad score. This animal, opposed tissue, nothing, looking really good. That's a good score. Then the composite was just a Euclidean distance of the 2 that we scaled 0 to 10, 10 being the worst, 0 being the worst, 10 being the worst, 0 being the best, excuse me. So wound closure, you can see that proportionally gets better through time. You might expect that. Infections get worse through time, or excuse me, not necessarily get worse, but there's not a whole lot of change, right? There's not that distinct cascading of good scores. And then that's also reflected in the composite score, which was really interesting. So day 4, the first score, the average was 6.5 or so. After that, the mean scores didn't change. They were the same throughout all the day. You get a little more variance or a little variance, but overall, that first wound score was the real important one, which is important in field studies. You can tell pretty soon if, you can tell pretty soon if an animal is healthy or not. So swim tests, did a burst swim, squirted a lamprey with a pipette of water, and measured its distance in the first half second of swimming. We did it 3 times, took the max value, and we did find a difference, a significant difference between the two. The control animals swam on average about 22% faster than the tagged animals. But you can see this range. The tagged animal actually swam the fastest. The fastest animal was a tagged animal. And we ran just a pretty basic general linear model with 2 covariates, the group, if tagged or untagged, and then the source, anadromous or Great Lakes. The group, like I said, the tagged animal significantly slower, source wasn't a significant covariate. But what was interesting on this is that the composite score was a predictor for the tagged group. Each additional score, each additional number on the score was associated with negative 1.8 centimeters a second. This is just the regression line. And you can see the control mean right about where you would expect that intercept to be. And what's interesting is these healthy animals, quote unquote healthy animals, score under 6. More or less the mean was pretty close to the same, which is quality information that we want to know. So swim to exhaustion, the methods, put them in a swim tunnel, had it wired with an electroshocker in the back with a mild dose of electricity just to keep them swimming if they stopped, did a constant elapsed time running clock for each group. The results, they weren't significantly different. So this is a time to event curve. You can see this was on day 30, I should mention. So there had been some mortalities in the tagged group. So at this point, really the healthy animals that had survived the duration of what we expect the battery life to be. And for those animals, they weren't significantly different than the control animals. So what the conclusions we came from that is it's dependent on wound health. From the burst model and the composite score modeling, we've got a significant covariate of composite score. And then with the swim to exhaustion, the healthy animals, quote unquote healthy again, that had survived 30 days, they were swimming about the same as the control animals. So survival, real quick, historically, these are the 2 survival methods, a Kaplan-Meier curve, which is similar to that time to event from the swim test, and then a Cox proportional hazard model. Both of them, they're great modeling tools, but there are a little bit of weaknesses when it comes to looking at time, like introspectively throughout the timeline. They both show differences. So the Kaplan-Meier, for example, this p-value 0.01 is the p-value for all 61 days. They're significantly different, the 2 groups, the survival. However, when you look at it, through time in the timeline, you see there's some effects here. You got a lot of early mortality. You have this cascading mortality after the swim test, but more importantly, this line is what I call the roaming p-value that is basically if the experiment started on this day, what would the p-value be? And if you erase these early mortalities, if you were to start the experiment on day 5 and just nullify those mortalities, you don't see a significant difference between the 2 groups. That significant difference is driven by the early mortalities. And then the Cox proportional hazard, we put a time-dependent covariate in there to see if this effect was associated with time. And it was. The first 32 days, the tagged group 7.4 times more likely to experience the hazard. But after the 32 days, that effect dissipates to only 20%, 22%, excuse me. So again, that survival is heavily weighted towards the early mortalities, which is something we want to know in the field. So our conclusion with survival, again, the early mortalities drive the group response, which lead to our conclusions, suggest a viable piece of technology under the right conditions. What those conditions are is you have to know the wound health of the animal, and which is something you can find out pretty soon after surgery. So for field studies, I did a holding period to see the animals that died for 3 days before I put them in the field. And then, that's some other, for other studies, explore different size metrics besides total length. But with that, I'm running out of time, I know. So special thanks to funders, Michigan State, Professor Wagner. And with that, I don't know if we have any time, but I'll take questions.
Thanks, Taylor. Let's see. I don't see a lot of clapping hands. Oh, we do have a hand raised. Joshua Hochwater.
Hey, Taylor, can you hear me?
I can, yep.
Okay. Great presentation.
Thank you.
I was curious if you had an idea of what the overall tag retention rates were through like the 40-day period or the life of the battery in the tag lamprey.
Yeah, so it wasn't super great. We had 9 animals shed tags. 2 of those, though, however, were after 30 days. So I guess 7 in the expected life expectancy of the tag. But every single one of the animals that shed a tag had a wound closure score of 4, being the worst. So these animals were really small, as I mentioned. So that was a big driver. But the good news is it's a very predictable outcome, I guess. You can look almost immediately after surgery and say, that wound doesn't look that great. That animal has a high likelihood of shedding the tag.
All right, thank you. I only ask because I have anecdotal evidence like every person in the world, but I know somebody who was tagging lamprey down south, and I believe he told me anecdotally that he was using super glue to seal up his wounds for the initial tagging, and he said it was helping him increase his tag retention in the early stages.
Yeah, and Josh, for the field, just anecdotally again from the field study that I just performed, we didn't have any animals that shed the tag in the first 3 days, but they were also quite larger animals. So that kind of with the recommendations of my animals were pretty small. If you pick the animals that are right on that length density that I showed you, I think you're going to have a lot less problems. And the super glue, that's not something we did. I thought about it, but it's definitely something that is in the literature of people doing, and it probably does have some effect on a positive correlation with tag retention.
We have time for more questions if anybody has any. Looks like Tom Locke.
Hi, Taylor.
Hey.
Excellent talk.
Thank you.
So I'm curious. So you mentioned that it seemed like early mortality was potentially an issue, and also maybe infections. And so a couple of things. I'm wondering, were you estimating infection visually, and also I may have missed it, but were you also using like a disinfectant for your surgeries, like chlorhexidine or anything like that?
So the first part of your question, it was a visual inspection. I took pictures and it scored them visually, which one of the assumptions of the model is that the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4 scores are of equal distance apart from each other, which that's an assumption that we were fine with making. But there was not any, besides qualitative metric. We didn't disinfect the animals. So historically in some of these other lab studies, they had a big issue with fungus growth, which led to a lot of mortality. Those animals were in warmer water, about 12 degrees Celsius. Our animals were, like I said, about 4.5. So that limited the amount of fungal growth. And we didn't see, so the infection, we never saw any foreign growth on the animal. We didn't see any bacteria or fungus, like I mentioned. And we didn't use a disinfectant agent. These animals were really small. In fact, other studies, like for example, use sutures, and they noticed like with those suture marks that infection would grow around that extra hole. So I didn't really want to inject them with anything, put another wound in them. So no, we didn't. And we didn't, like I said, there was no reason throughout the study where we looked and we said, man, we should have done that. We should have put some betadine on them or something like that. So thank you for your question.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks.